The church was filled with mourners, the air heavy with the scent of lilies and the muted whispers of sadness that seemed to seep into the very bones of the old building. The walls, lined with stained glass windows depicting scenes from a life of faith, cast colorful patterns across the pews, but there was little to celebrate today. It had been a quiet, somber affair, just like Aunt Margaret would have wanted. The type of funeral where no one dared to speak too loudly, where every movement felt calculated and every glance exchanged was heavy with meaning. The pews were lined with familiar faces, family, friends, distant relatives who had come to pay their respects. But something was different today. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, a thick weight that no one could quite place, yet all could feel. As the service began, the Reverend's voice echoed through the hall, soft and reverent, recounting Aunt Margaret's life, her accomplishments, and the kindness she had shown to all who knew her. The congregation, wrapped in a blanket of grief, clung to every word as though it might provide a shred of comfort in the midst of their sorrow. But no amount of words could truly ease the emptiness that everyone in the room felt. People wiped away their tears as they listened, each memory of her bringing both comfort and a fresh wave of grief. Yet, despite the heartfelt words, there was one person in the back of the room who seemed to stand apart from the rest. He had arrived silently, taking a seat at the very back of the church, his features hidden in the shadows cast by the high windows. His presence was not immediately noticeable, but his stillness stood in stark contrast to the rest of the mourners. The man seemed to blend into the background, but there was something about him that made the air around him seem thicker, more oppressive. It was as though he didn't belong, yet his calm composure suggested otherwise. As the service continued, and the Reverend spoke of Aunt Margaret's generosity, her unwavering strength and her gentle spirit, the stranger remained unmoved. His eyes never left the casket at the front of the church. There was something unnerving about his gaze, as though it wasn't just the body in that box that commanded his attention, but something far deeper, something tied to his own personal history. He wasn't there simply as a visitor. No, this man had a purpose, one that was not yet clear to anyone in the room. The murmur of conversations grew quieter as the minutes ticked by, and every now and then someone's eyes would flicker back to him, unsure of who he was or why he had come. Who was this man sitting alone in the back, his every movement so deliberate? Why was he watching the casket with such intensity? The questions swirled, unanswered, like the rising tension in the room, growing thicker with every passing moment. It wasn't until the final moments of the service that the man stood up. The movement was slow, almost deliberate, as though he had been waiting for the exact right moment. As if he knew that this was the time, the one moment when he could reveal himself, when all eyes would inevitably be on him. Heads turned in shock as the stranger walked toward the altar, each step measured, each footfall amplifying the silence that had descended over the room. His presence, so sudden and so unexpected, sent a ripple through the congregation. Whispers erupted from all sides, people exchanging looks of confusion and concern. Was this someone they knew? Had they missed him at some earlier point in the service, or had he just appeared from nowhere, like a ghost who had materialized in their midst? The stranger's face was still partially obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the sense of gravity that surrounded him. His every action seemed purposeful, calculated, as though he had rehearsed it all in his mind. He reached the front of the church, and with a calmness that struck everyone as profoundly out of place in such a solemn setting, he cleared his throat. The sound, though soft, reverberated in the silent room, capturing the attention of every person present. "I'm her son," he said simply, his voice clear and unwavering, but there was something chilling about the way he spoke, as if he were announcing something that everyone should have already known. The words seemed to echo in the hearts and minds of the mourners, hanging in the air long after he had spoken. The claim was so audacious, so utterly unexpected, that it sent shockwaves through the room. Aunt Margaret had no children. She had never been married, and as far as anyone knew, she had no surviving family members other than her siblings. So who was this man? And why had he waited until this very moment to make such a bold declaration? His words cut through the quiet like a blade, leaving nothing but confusion and a sense of unease in their wake. Murmurs spread like wildfire through the congregation. Some people stood frozen, unsure of how to react, while others exchanged frantic glances, searching for answers that no one could provide. Was this man telling the truth? Had Aunt Margaret hidden a part of her life so carefully that even her closest relatives had never known about it? Or was this some kind of cruel hoax, a stranger seizing the opportunity to disrupt a moment of collective grief for reasons unknown? The man stood there, his posture unwavering, and for a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The tension in the air was palpable, so thick that it felt like the very walls of the church were closing in on them. No one moved, No one dared to speak as the questions piled on top of each other. Who was this man, and what was the truth behind his claim? The room buzzed with confusion as the man's words hung in the air like a dark cloud. The Reverend paused mid-sentence, his face a mask of disbelief, unsure of how to proceed in the face of such an unexpected interruption. The rest of the congregation shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some casting furtive glances at one another, others staring at the stranger as if they were trying to decipher the truth written on his face. No one dared to speak, but the silence was deafening, amplifying every anxious breath, every subtle shift in posture. The man who had claimed to be Aunt Margaret's son remained perfectly still, as though he had already won some silent battle and was merely waiting for the world to catch up. His eyes locked onto the casket, and for a brief moment it seemed as if the entire room held its breath, awaiting his next move. Several family members exchanged hurried whispers, some openly questioning the man's claim. "Who is he? I've never seen him before," murmured one of Aunt Margaret's nieces, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Others were more skeptical. "Impossible. Aunt Margaret would have told us if she had a son," someone else whispered, though the doubt in their voice was clear. The man hadn't flinched when he made his announcement. There was no sign of hesitation or nervousness in his demeanor. If anything, his calmness was what unsettled everyone most. His posture was unyielding, his expression unreadable, as though his presence alone was enough to silence the room. For a brief moment, the family's grief and mourning were replaced with a sense of betrayal, the shock of the stranger's intrusion consuming their attention. It was Aunt Margaret's sister Helen who finally stood up from her seat at the front of the church. Her movements were stiff, her hands gripping the edge of the pew in front of her, as if she were holding on for support. Helen had been Aunt Margaret's closest confidant, the one person who had known her inside and out, or so she thought. Her eyes narrowed as she locked onto the man at the front of the room, searching for some semblance of recognition. She took a few steps toward him, her voice trembling with emotion as she asked, "Who are you? What are you talking about?" Margaret never had a child. Her words were laced with both fury and confusion, but there was something else behind them, a deep, gnawing sense of dread. She had to know the truth. This stranger couldn't possibly be telling the truth, could he? Could her sister have kept such a monumental secret for all these years? The man's gaze shifted briefly from the casket to Helen, his eyes still calm, almost detached. Without a hint of hesitation, he spoke again, this time with a quiet conviction that sent chills down everyone's spine. "I'm not lying," he said simply. "I'm Margaret's son, and I've come to claim what's mine." His voice was soft, but carried an underlying force, as though he were standing on the edge of some precipice and knew exactly what would happen next. The room seemed to contract, suffocating under the weight of his words. People were beginning to murmur once more, their voices rising in a cacophony of disbelief and shock. Some seemed to believe him, while others remained adamant that he was nothing more than a fraud, trying to capitalize on their grief. But the longer the man stood there, unyielding and resolute, the more difficult it became for the mourners to dismiss him. Helen's eyes narrowed further as she turned to face the congregation, pleading for someone to back her up, to confirm that this man was a liar. But the room had become divided. Half of the mourners were now looking at the man with a strange, unspoken understanding, as though they were beginning to believe him. The other half remained skeptical, casting sideways glances and shaking their heads. It was as though the very fabric of reality had begun to unravel in the wake of the man's revelation. The stranger, however, seemed unfazed by the turmoil he had caused. His expression never wavered, his posture remained rigid, and his eyes continued to flicker from one person to another, never losing their calm intensity. But what was his purpose here? Why had he waited until this moment to reveal himself? Was there something more to his claim than met the eye? The room had descended into chaos, and yet the man at the front of the church remained eerily calm. His claim that he was Aunt Margaret's son was being met with disbelief, but his presence was undeniable. Every minute that passed seemed to stretch the tension in the room further, as though time itself had frozen, hanging in the balance between truth and deceit. The whispers grew louder, voices rising in a crescendo of confusion, disbelief, and anger. The mourners were no longer able to hold their emotions in check. Some were visibly shaken, struggling to understand how such a thing could be true, while others were furious, demanding answers. "How dare you?" one of Margaret's cousins shouted, standing up abruptly. "This is a funeral, not a circus. Get out of here before I call the police." But the stranger didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the outburst. His eyes remained fixed on the casket, as though he had seen something that no one else could understand. Helen, her face pale and streaked with tears, was shaking as she stood near the altar, staring at the man in utter disbelief. She had spent her entire life alongside Margaret, sharing secrets, stories, and memories, and yet here was a stranger, claiming to be her son. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle, her emotions a whirlwind of rage and sorrow. How could Margaret have kept such a secret? Was it possible that this man was telling the truth? The very thought was too much for her to bear, and she felt a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal creeping into her chest. She had loved her sister more than anyone, and the idea that Margaret had hidden something so profound from her made Helen feel as though the ground beneath her was slipping away. "No," she whispered, almost to herself. "This can't be real. Margaret would never lie. She would never keep something like this from me." Her voice cracked with pain, but as the man stood there unwavering, a part of her began to wonder if she was wrong. The Reverend, still standing at the pulpit, was clearly at a loss. He had officiated countless funerals, but never had he encountered a moment like this. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edges of the lectern, trying to regain his composure. His voice, when it came, was strained and full of confusion. I don't know what to say. This is highly irregular. Who are you?" he asked the stranger, his tone a mixture of authority and fear. But the man didn't answer him directly. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes still locked on the casket. "You know who I am," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm the son you never knew existed, the son Margaret abandoned years ago." The words hit the room like a thunderclap, and for a moment it felt as though everyone had collectively stopped breathing. The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of his revelation. Margaret had a son. She had abandoned him, but why? Why had she kept this from everyone? The questions spun wildly in the minds of the mourners, each person grappling with the implications of what they were hearing. The stranger's gaze never wavered, and now, as he stepped closer to the casket, a chill ran down Helen's spine. She could feel the icy fingers of fear creeping into her thoughts. "What do you mean, abandoned?" she asked, her voice shaking as she took a step forward, unable to control the surge of emotion that bubbled up inside her. The stranger turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "Margaret was forced to make a choice, and she chose to leave me behind. She was young, scared, and unable to care for me. But I never forgot her. I grew up wondering who she was, wondering if she ever thought about me too." His voice softened on the last words, and for the briefest moment there was a flicker of something, perhaps pain, perhaps regret in his eyes. But just as quickly as it appeared, the emotion was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. "I've spent years trying to find her," he continued, "and when I heard she was gone, I knew I had to come. I had to know the truth. I had to see where I came from." Helen's knees buckled and she staggered backward, gripping the pew in front of her for support. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, and her vision blurred with unshed tears. The stranger's words had struck a deep, painful chord inside her, but it didn't make sense. How could Margaret have kept something like this hidden from everyone? The man's story was tragic, and yet something about it felt incomplete, as though he were only telling part of the story. The room had grown so silent that it felt suffocating, the only sound the pounding of Helen's heart in her chest. She looked around at the others in the room, but no one seemed to have the answers. Some looked at her with pity, while others were still too stunned to react. But no one had expected this. "Margaret, she would never have abandoned you," Helen whispered, as if speaking to herself. "I would have known. I would have—" But the words trailed off, drowned in the flood of confusion and doubt that threatened to overwhelm her. The man's gaze softened for a moment, and he took a step closer to Helen, his voice dropping to a quiet, almost soothing tone. "I don't blame her," he said, as though sensing her turmoil. "I know she must have had her reasons, but I can't help but wonder, if I had been part of her life, would things have been different? Would we have had a chance to know each other?" His words were laden with sorrow, but the question lingered in the air, a reminder that there were things left unsaid, truths yet to be uncovered. Helen stood there, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Grief, confusion, anger, and a deep, gnawing sense of loss. She had always known Margaret as a woman of integrity, someone who had never wavered in her commitment to family. But now, in the face of this revelation, she was forced to confront a version of her sister that she had never known, a version that left her questioning everything she thought she knew. The man had shattered her perception of the past, and with each word he spoke, the pieces of her world seemed to slip further out of place. Helen stood at the edge of the altar, her heart pounding in her chest, as the stranger's words reverberated in her mind. The room felt as though it were spinning, each person in the church seemingly caught in the undertow of emotions, none knowing which way to turn. The grief that had once been so overwhelming now seemed distant, replaced by something far darker, far more complicated. The stranger, this man who claimed to be Margaret's son, was still standing near the casket, his eyes unyielding, his presence a heavy weight in the air. He had disrupted their mourning, shattered their quiet ritual of remembrance, and now, with every passing second, it seemed as if the very fabric of reality itself was beginning to unravel. His calmness, his certainty, only served to deepen the uncertainty that gripped everyone in the room. The questions were multiplying, each one more troubling than the last, and yet the man remained unmoved, as if this was all part of a plan he had been preparing for years. Helen's mind raced, her thoughts colliding in a jumbled mess. Her sister had always been so meticulous, so careful. How could Margaret have hidden something so monumental for so long? The family had always been close, and yet yet, in the blink of an eye, everything she had believed to be true was being questioned. The pain that surged through her chest wasn't just from the loss of her sister. It was from the devastation of discovering that there had been a whole chapter of Margaret's life that no one had known about. Helen looked back at the man, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief, anger, and disbelief. She wanted to scream at him, demand that he leave, but something in her held her back. There was something about the way he stood there, so composed, so resolute, that made her wonder if he wasn't telling the truth. Could this really be her sister's son? Could he have been hidden away for all these years? Or was he just a stranger, playing some cruel game? The uncertainty gnawed at her like a sickness, and for a moment she felt as though she were losing control of everything around her. The Reverend, still stunned by the turn of events, cleared his throat and stepped forward. His voice was trembling, but he did his best to maintain composure. "This is highly irregular," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "But perhaps we should all take a step back and allow for some clarity. There must be an explanation." But the stranger, his face impassive, did not look at the Reverend. He turned slightly, his gaze once again fixing on the casket, as if he were speaking to the room, not just the people standing before him. "I'm not here for your forgiveness," he said, his voice echoing through the church. "I'm not here to stir up any more pain. I just need to know the truth. I've spent my entire life searching for answers, and now that I've found them, I will not leave until I understand what happened." His words were quiet, but forceful, and it became clear that no matter what the rest of the room believed, he was determined to stay. The air grew heavier, thick with tension. It was as if a storm was brewing, and no one knew when it would break. Helen's gaze shifted from the stranger to the casket. She could hardly bear to look at it, knowing that beneath the polished wood lay the woman who had been the center of her world for so long. How could Margaret have kept such a secret? How could she have lived a life so far removed from the family that had loved her? The thoughts swirled in her mind, but she couldn't grasp hold of any answers. There was a gnawing emptiness in her chest, as though the pieces of the puzzle were there but they didn't fit together. Her sister's life, her carefully constructed image, was now shattered, broken by a single man's claim. Was it possible that this was the son Margaret had hidden away all those years ago? The revelation seemed impossible, but in the face of this man's calm demeanor, the possibility loomed larger than ever. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice, her mind teetering between disbelief and reluctant acceptance. What if the stranger was right? What if her sister had kept this secret for a reason that no one would ever fully understand? The mourners, still in stunned silence, began to shift uneasily in their seats. Some whispered amongst themselves, while others stared at the stranger with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. The room was divided. Some of them believed him, some of them didn't, but all of them were unsettled by the profound impact of his presence. The stranger remained rooted to the spot, his back straight, his face unreadable, as if he were an immovable object in the center of a storm. He didn't flinch as people cast doubtful glances his way, nor did he seem to care when the whispers grew louder. He had come here for something, and he wasn't going to leave until he had it. The truth about his past, the truth about Aunt Margaret. For him, this was more than just a funeral. It was the culmination of a search that had lasted a lifetime, and no one, not even the grief-stricken family of the woman he claimed as his mother, could stop him from uncovering it. "I need to know why," he said again, his voice now tinged with an edge of desperation. "I need to know why she left me, why she never came back, why she never told you all about me." Helen felt her knees weaken, and she stumbled back, gripping the edge of the pew for support. Her world had been turned upside down, and the confusion, the hurt, the betrayal were all too much to bear. She felt the weight of the room pressing down on her, the stares of the others cutting through her like daggers. The stranger's words rang in her ears, repeating over and over again, "Why did she leave me?" The question was simple, but its implications were devastating. What had Margaret been hiding? What had caused her to abandon her son? As Helen stood there, frozen, unable to move or speak, the truth seemed to come closer and closer. It was a truth that neither she nor anyone else in that room was ready to face. The man had come to find answers, and in doing so he had opened a door that no one could ever close again. The room was silent now, the tension thick in the air, as every eye remained on the stranger. The question he had asked, "Why did she leave me?" still hung heavy, unanswered, like an oppressive shadow. The man, once a stranger, had become the center of everything, his claim unsettling not only the family but also the very memory of Aunt Margaret. Helen stood motionless at the front, her thoughts whirling, her heart torn between disbelief and the dawning realization that somehow her sister had carried this secret for all these years. She could barely comprehend it. How had Margaret lived with such a burden, and why had she kept it hidden from everyone who had loved her? The weight of the unknown pressed heavily on her, suffocating her in its grasp, and she wondered if she would ever truly understand the woman her sister had been. Helen's voice broke the silence. her words strained with emotion. "I don't know why," she whispered, the ache in her voice reflecting the depth of her sorrow and confusion. She took a slow, hesitant step toward the man. "But whatever happened, Margaret wasn't just your mother, she was my sister, and I have to believe that she had her reasons." Her words seemed to linger in the air, as if the truth she was seeking was just out of reach. For a long moment, the stranger said nothing, his face unreadable. Then finally his eyes softened, the hardness that had once defined him now replaced by a flicker of something deeper, perhaps pain, perhaps regret. He nodded slightly, as though accepting that he would never get the answers he had come for, that some questions were destined to remain unanswered. The years of searching had led him here, but now, in this moment of quiet understanding, he seemed to realize that the truth was more complicated than he had ever imagined. The Reverend, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward again, his voice gentle but firm. "I know that this situation is not what any of us expected, but what we can all agree on is that Margaret's legacy lives on, not just in her absence, but in the lives she touched. She was a woman of strength, of grace, of compassion, and though this revelation may be difficult to accept, it doesn't change the love and the memory we hold for her." His words hung in the room, a reminder that despite the confusion, despite the pain, the essence of who Margaret was remained with them. The stranger, still standing near the casket, closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the Reverend's words. His expression softened, and for the first time since he had arrived, there seemed to be a hint of peace in his features. Perhaps this wasn't the closure he had expected, but in some way it was enough to start the healing process. Helen, though still devastated, felt a small flicker of something stir within her, something akin to acceptance. She had wanted answers, and she had received none, yet she understood now that some answers were never meant to be fully understood. Margaret's life had been complicated, filled with choices that no one could fully comprehend, but in the end, those choices had shaped the woman who had been so beloved to everyone who knew her. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper as she turned to face the stranger. "But I understand that you've been searching for something your whole life, something you thought you lost, and maybe that's something I can respect." The man's eyes met hers, and he nodded slowly, a quiet understanding passing between them. There were no more words to be said. The past was a complicated thing, filled with both light and darkness, and sometimes all they could do was move forward, carrying the weight of those unspoken truths. As the mourners began to leave one by one, the stranger remained by the casket, his head bowed in quiet reflection. The room that had once been filled with grief and confusion now felt quieter, almost peaceful. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the lingering sense that life, with all its uncertainties and secrets, was something to be cherished, even in its brokenness. Helen stood for a moment longer, watching the stranger. He had come searching for something, and though he hadn't found what he had hoped for, he had been given something else, a chance at understanding, a moment of connection. And in that, perhaps, there was a form of closure, a way to begin healing, even if the past could never be fully rewritten. The doors of the church opened, and as Helen stepped out into the cool air, she realized that some stories would never be fully told, but that didn't mean they weren't worth remembering. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts.